His phone rang. He looked at the screen. And then he stood up and walked out the door while his pregnant wife was still sitting at the table, her hands trembling. The words she had spent 11 weeks gathering the courage to say still hanging in the air between them. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She just watched him go. And somewhere in that silence, in the sound of the door clicking shut behind the man who was supposed to be the love of her life, something inside Elowen Veyr quietly, permanently broke. If that had been you sitting at that table, what would you have done? If you're watching this and you've ever been made to feel invisible by someone who's supposed to see you, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what Elowen does next will absolutely floor you. Hit that like button and drop your city or country. In the comments, I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The dinner had taken Elowen 3 hours to prepare. Not because she didn't know how to cook, she did. And she was good at it. One of those quiet competencies she'd developed over 6 years of marriage to a man whose world was always on the verge of catching fire. She knew how to time a meal around an uncertain schedule. She knew how to keep lamb warm without drying it out. She knew the exact temperature at which Cassian preferred his wine, and the way he liked the table, set not formal, not casual, somewhere in between, candles but not too many, low light but not dark. She knew all of these things because she had spent 6 years learning the language of a man who rarely explained himself. But tonight the dinner wasn't really about food. The lamb, the wine, the specific running softly through the speakers, all of it was architecture. She was building a moment, the kind of moment where a person could say something important and feel, for once, like the words had space to land. 11 weeks. She had carried this secret for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of morning sickness she'd attributed to a stomach bug. 11 weeks of hiding prenatal vitamins at the back of the bathroom cabinet, tucked behind cold medicines and an old box of bandages. 11 weeks of lying flat on her back at 3 in the morning with one hand pressed against a stomach that was only just beginning to make itself known, having entire silent conversations with a person who didn't yet have a name. She wasn't hiding the pregnancy because she was ashamed. She was hiding it because she needed to say it right. She needed Cassian's full attention, both eyes, both hands, no phone on the table, no half presence, with one ear already tilted toward the door. She needed one clean, uninterrupted moment. That should not have been difficult to ask for. But with Cassian, it always was. The ultrasound photograph was in her purse. She had looked at it so many times over the past 11 weeks that the edges had gone soft, the corners starting to curl. A small gray shape, barely a suggestion of a human being, but the most real thing Elowen had ever seen in her life. She had cried in the parking lot of the medical building when the technician first showed it to her. Not from joy exactly, or not only from joy, from something more complicated than that. From the sudden weight of understanding that everything was about to change, whether Cassian was ready or not. She sat across from him now, watching him cut his lamb with the precise economy of movement that was characteristic of everything he did. Cassian Veyr was not a man who wasted motion. He spoke carefully, moved carefully, made decisions with a quiet deliberateness that the people who feared him often mistook for coldness. Elowen had learned early in their marriage that it wasn't coldness. It was control. Cassian controlled everything within his reach, and the discipline required to maintain that control had, over the years, calcified around him like a second skeleton. He was not a cruel man. She needed to be honest with herself about that, even now. He had never raised a hand to her, never spoken to her with contempt, never deliberately tried to diminish her. The damage Cassian Veyr did was the damage of perpetual absence, the way he could be physically present in a room and still somehow not quite there. The way his attention, when it landed on her, felt borrowed rather than given. "This is good," he said, gesturing at the food with his fork. "Thank you. You didn't have to go to all this. I wanted to," she said. And then, before the moment could dissolve into ordinary dinner conversation, before another 20 minutes passed in pleasant, careful distance, Cassian. He looked up. His eyes were dark and attentive. That was another thing people misunderstood about him. Cassian did listen. He listened with an almost unnerving focus when he chose to direct it at you. For a moment, with his full gaze on her face, Elowen felt the flutter of the feeling that had made her love him in the first place. The sense that when Cassian Veyr decided you mattered, you felt it in your bones. She reached into her purse. Her fingers found the photograph without looking. She had handled it so many times she could identify it by touch. But she didn't pull it out yet. She wanted to say the words first. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you for a while now." She paused. Her heart was doing something embarrassing, slamming against her ribs like it was trying to escape. "I'm pregnant." The two words fell into the space between them. Cassian went very still. She watched his face move through something she couldn't entirely read. Shock, she thought, and beneath the shock, something that might have been wonder. His fork lowered to the plate. His jaw shifted. For one brief, extraordinary second, his expression was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen in years. She started to pull the photograph from her purse. His phone rang. The sound sliced through the room like something physical. Cassian's eyes dropped to the table before he'd even made a conscious decision to look, and Elowen's saw it, that reflexive shift of attention, so practiced it had become involuntary. She watched him look at the screen. She watched his face change. She knew, before he said a word, whose name was on that screen. Sabine. Sabine Kessler, who had been part of Cassian's life longer than Elowen had. Sabine, who was always in some form of emergency. Sabine, who had called during their first anniversary dinner, during Elowen's mother's funeral, during a weekend they'd spent in Italy that was supposed to be a reset for a marriage that had been quietly fraying at the edges for years. Cassian pushed his chair back. The scrape of the chair legs against the floor was very loud. Cassian. Elowen heard her own voice and was faintly surprised by how steady it was. "I just told you we're having a baby." He paused at the edge of the table. The phone was still ringing. "I know. I heard you." He said it with the particular tone he used when he was managing a situation rather than existing inside it. "Give me 10 minutes. Don't do this." The phone stopped ringing. Then, almost immediately, it started again. Something crossed Cassian's face, a flash of something she couldn't name. Conflict, maybe, or the effort of suppressing some conflict. His hand tightened around the phone. "I'll be back within the hour," he said. "We'll talk when I get back." She reached across the table and closed her hand around his wrist. Touch stopped him. "You're leaving your pregnant wife," Elowen said, to run to her. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation framed as a question. It was just a sentence, laid flat on the table between them, like evidence. Cassian looked at her hand on his wrist. He looked at her face. And in his eyes, she saw something that broke her heart more thoroughly than anger would have. She saw that he understood exactly what he was doing, and that he was going to do it anyway. "I will explain when I'm back," he said. "I promise." He gently removed her hand from his wrist, and then he walked to the door. And then he was gone. The sound the door made when it closed was not dramatic. It was just a door, a soft mechanical click, the kind of sound a door makes 1,000 times in a marriage without meaning anything at all. Except that this time it meant everything. Elowen sat alone at the table. The lamp was still warm. The candles were still burning. The wine in Cassian's glass caught the light in a way that was almost beautiful. Her hand had found its way to her stomach. She didn't remember deciding to put it there, and she sat like that for a long time, not moving, not crying, not doing anything at all. She took the ultrasound photograph out of her purse and set it on the table beside her plate. She looked at it. Then she looked at the door. She thought about the 6 years behind her. The dinner she had spent 3 hours preparing. The 11 weeks she had spent waiting for the right moment. The ultrasound photograph with its soft, curled edges. The small gray shape that was becoming, whether anyone was ready or not, a person. She thought, "I am 34 years old, and I have just told my husband that I am carrying his child, and he chose to answer his phone." And then, with a clarity that surprised her by being entirely without drama, Elowen Veyr understood that she was done waiting. She didn't move quickly. That was the thing about Elowen. She had never been a woman who acted from panic. She thought before she moved. She had always thought before she moved. It was one of the qualities Cassian had once told her he admired most about her, back when he still said things like that. She finished her dinner alone. She drank her water. She blew out the candles, and then she went to the bedroom and pulled a suitcase from the back of the closet. She had a system. She had, in fact, been building a system for a long time without quite admitting to herself that she was doing it. A financial notebook in the drawer of her home office, separate accounts in her maiden name, a small lakeside property purchased 2 years earlier as an investment that she had told Cassian about, and he had approved without asking any details. Medical records kept in a personal file, not the shared household file. An emergency envelope of cash tucked inside the cover of a hardback book on the second shelf. She had told herself these were precautions. She had told herself she was being practical. The wife of a man in Cassian's world needed to be practical. But standing in the bedroom with the suitcase open on the bed, she understood that some part of her had known for a long time that this night was coming. She packed methodically. Clothes first, not everything, just what she needed. Then the things that mattered: medical records, prenatal documentation, passport, financial notebook, the emergency cash, a photograph of her mother, 2 books she was in the middle of reading. She left the jewelry, all of it except the pieces her mother had given her. She stood at the bedroom dresser for a moment, looking at her wedding ring. Then she took it off. The skin underneath was faintly pale, slightly indented the ghost of something that had been there a long time. She set the ring on the dresser. She took out a piece of paper and a pen. She thought for a moment about what to write, and then wrote the only thing that was actually true. You chose her on the night I told you about our child. Now I choose our child over you. She left the note beside the ring. She left the ultrasound photograph on the kitchen table where Cassian would see it when he came in. She took her suitcase. She walked out before sunrise while the city was still dark and the streets were almost empty, while Chicago was making the quiet sounds it makes before it remembers to be loud again. She didn't look back at the building. She got into the car she had called ahead of time and gave the driver an address and sat back against the seat with one hand on her stomach and her eyes straight ahead. Her daughter, she had decided, alone in the dark, that it was a daughter moved inside her. Or maybe she imagined it because it was still early, still too early to feel much. But she felt something, a small insistent presence. A reminder. She wasn't running away, she was running toward. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive in a wave. It seeps in slowly, cold and quiet, like water finding the gaps in a foundation. Elowen felt it in the car and on the drive out of the city, and in the weeks that followed as she settled into a routine that had nothing to do with Cassian's world. She went to her prenatal appointments alone. She learned how to cook for one, with sorry for herself about it now. She set up the small office in the lakeside property and began the work she had always done: the financial analysis, the strategic consultation, quiet architecture of keeping complicated business structures from collapsing, except that now she did it entirely for herself, under her own name, as her own entity. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She had simply spent years making herself invisible inside Cassian's operation, letting the work look like his, letting the stability look like his, because that was what the position of wife in his world required. No more. She called no one in Cassian's circle. She blocked the numbers she needed to block. She had prepared for this with enough care that disappearing was not difficult. It was, in fact, surprisingly clean. A woman who has spent years being systematically overlooked leaves very few traces. She thought about Cassian every day. She would not pretend otherwise. 6 years of marriage leaves marks that don't simply lift because you've made a decision. Thought about the version of him she had fallen in love with, sharp and complicated, and occasionally unexpectedly tender. She thought about the way he used to bring her coffee without being asked, the exact way she took it, without making a production of the gesture. She thought about the early years, when they would lie in bed on Sunday mornings talking about nothing in particular, and how she had thought back then that this was what it was supposed to feel like. She did not think about Sabine. Thinking about Sabine was a luxury she couldn't afford, not because it was too painful, but because it wasn't useful. Sabine was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was simpler and sadder. Cassian had never learned to choose Elowen first. Not because she wasn't worth choosing, but because he had never been forced to understand the cost of not choosing her. Until now. She was 7 weeks further along, when she finally allowed herself to cry, really cry, ugly and thorough, and without any particular trigger, sitting on the floor of the nursery she had begun putting together, surrounded by flat-packed furniture and paint swatches in soft yellows and warm greens. She cried for the marriage she had wanted it to be, for the dinner, for the 11 weeks of waiting for the right moment, for the photograph with the curled edges and the small gray shape that had looked at her from a screen and made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like she was enough of a reason. And then she wiped her face. She ordered dinner. She put the paint swatches in order of preference and made a decision about the color of the walls. Kept moving. That was the thing Elowen had always known how to do, even before Cassian, even before any of this. She knew how to keep moving when everything around her was coming apart. It was not a skill she had chosen to develop. It was a skill circumstances had developed in her, starting long before she ever sat down at a dinner table across from a man who would one day not look up from his phone. Kept moving, and somewhere in Chicago, in a penthouse, with 2 cold plates and an ultrasound photograph. On the kitchen table, Cassian Veyr came home to an empty apartment and finally began to understand what he had actually done. Cassian stood in the kitchen for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. He knew it was 4 minutes and 40 seconds because the digital clock on the microwave was the only light source in the room, and he had nothing to do but stand there and watch the numbers change, while his brain worked very slowly through something it did not want to process. The ultrasound photograph was on the table. He had almost missed it. He had come in through the service entrance the way he always did, dropped his keys on the counter, reached for the light switch, and then his hand had stopped because something about the apartment felt wrong in a way that was physical before it was intellectual. Particular quality of silence, the kind of silence that has a shape. He turned the kitchen light on. The photograph was propped against the base of one of the candle holders. Both candles had been burned down and snuffed out. 2 plates sat on the table, both of them washed and dried and stacked to one side. Elowen had cleared the dinner before she left, which, for some reason, was the detail that hit him hardest. She had cleaned up after the dinner. She had washed the plates. Even then, even in the middle of whatever she was feeling, she had done that. He picked up the photograph. The image meant very little to him in any technical sense. He understood that it was an ultrasound. He understood that the gray blur in the center was a fetus, his child, the thing Elowen had been trying to tell him about across a candlelit table while he had been watching Sabine's name blink on his phone screen. He understood all of this, and still the image felt remote, like something he was seeing through thick glass. He set it down and went to the bedroom. The note was on the dresser, next to the wedding ring. He read it once. Then he read it again. The words were simple and direct, and they did not leave room for misinterpretation. You chose her on the night I told you about our child. Now I choose our child over you. He stood holding the piece of paper for a long time. The ring sat on the dresser surface, catching no light, looking smaller than he remembered it. He reached for his phone and called her. The line rang 3 times and went to a voicemail message that had already been changed. Not her voice. An automated system. She had anticipated this. She had anticipated him calling, and she had made it so there was nowhere for his voice to land. Called again. Same result. He sat down on the edge of the bed, their bed, which still smelled faintly of her, and for the first time in a very long time, Cassian Veyr had no idea what to do next. By morning, he had called Marcus. Marcus Hale was the closest thing Cassian had to a right hand, not in title, because Cassian didn't believe in titles for positions that didn't need to be named out loud, but in function. Marcus was the person who made problems disappear, who organized information, who kept the machine running when Cassian was occupied elsewhere. He was 51 years old, methodical, and almost completely without sentiment, which was why Cassian trusted him. He came to the penthouse at 7 in the morning and found Cassian still in last night's clothes, sitting at the kitchen table with the ultrasound photograph in front of him and a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Marcus looked at the photograph. He looked at Cassian. He did not say anything about the obvious. "Find her," Cassian said. "How much information do you have?" "Not enough. She used her maiden name on something property, maybe. She talked about a property once. I wasn't paying attention." He stopped. The admission cost him something. "I wasn't paying attention." Marcus pulled out his own phone and started writing. "Friends? Family? Her mother's been gone 6 years. No siblings. She had friends, but she stopped seeing them I don't know when. I didn't notice when." He said it flatly. He was not performing guilt. He was reciting facts, and the facts happened to be damning. "She's careful. She thinks ahead. She won't have left a clean trail." "I'll find something," Marcus said. He almost sounded certain. But there was something in the way his eyes moved over the photograph that told Cassian he had already registered what kind of situation this actually was. 3 days passed. Marcus found nothing that Cassian could act on. Property registered under Elowen's maiden name Hart in a lake community, roughly 40 miles outside Chicago. But the address turned out to be a shell of a structure that had been renovated and was owned through a trust she had apparently set up years earlier. She wasn't there. She had used the address as a placeholder, an anchor point, and she had known it would be the first place anyone looked. Cassian sent 2 men to confirm. He did not send them to bring her back. He wasn't sure yet that he had the right to bring her back. That uncertainty was new and deeply uncomfortable. He tried to return to work. The work tried to return to him. On the 4th day after Elowen left, Cassian had a meeting with the managing directors of 3 legitimate hotel properties in the downtown Chicago area. These were real companies, properly registered, publicly traded in a minor capacity, generating the kind of clean revenue that made everything else in his world easier to manage. He had acquired them over a period of 8 years. He understood them in the broad strokes occupancy rates, capital expenditure cycles, labor costs, the general mechanics of hospitality finance. What he did not understand, what he had not understood until the managing director started talking, and he realized within 4 minutes that he was lost, was the specific strategic architecture that held all 3 properties together as a functioning coherent unit rather than 3 separate assets with 3 separate headaches. He stopped the meeting after 20 minutes and dismissed the directors with a vague reference to rescheduling. After they left, he sat alone in the conference room and thought about the last 8 years. He thought about how often Elowen had sat in on preliminary discussions with these properties, how she had a habit of taking quiet notes during meetings she hadn't been formally invited to attend, how she had mentioned once, almost in passing, that the interconnected contract structure between 2 of the hotels was creating a tax exposure problem, and he had said handle it the way he said handle it about many things, and she had. He had assumed she handled it by hiring someone to handle it. Called Marcus back in. "I need you to find out who has been managing the financial strategy for the hotel portfolio," he said. Marcus looked at him for a moment. "I thought you had a team for that." "So did I." Marcus started making calls. He had answers by early afternoon. The answers were, in the word Marcus used when he delivered them, complicated. There was no external team. There was no high-powered consultancy buried in the budget that Cassian had simply never paid attention to. What there was, documented across years of emails and internal memos and contract revisions, was Elowen. Her maiden name appearing in correspondence he had never read, signed off on contracts he had approved, without reviewing the architectural logic of decisions he had benefited from, without ever asking who was building the architecture. She had been doing it for years. Not all of it she wasn't running the properties day to day. But the strategic layer, the thing underneath the operations that determined whether the operations were actually pointed in the right direction, that had been Elowen. his wife, whom he had installed in a beautiful apartment and purchased expensive jewelry for, and had assigned 2 bodyguards. The woman he had thought he was protecting she had, apparently, been the one quietly making sure he didn't collapse. Cassian sat with this for a long time. Then his phone rang. It was Dominic Ferraro, a man who controlled significant portions of Chicago's dockside shipping infrastructure and who had been a reliable commercial partner for 11 years. "I'm going to be direct with you," Ferraro said without preamble. "There's a restructuring conversation I was supposed to have had last month. I pushed it back because I was told your people were putting together a response package. Now I'm hearing there is no package. Who told you there was a package?" "Your wife. Or the person I assumed was acting in your wife's capacity." A brief pause. "Is something wrong on your end, Cassian?" "Nothing I can't handle. The restructuring conversation needs to happen within 2 weeks. Without a response package, I'm going to have to move in a direction that doesn't benefit either of us." Another pause, more pointed this time. "I have a great deal of respect for you. I'm telling you this as a professional courtesy. Get your house in order." The call ended. Cassian set his phone down. He looked at the wall for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said, to no one, very quietly, what the hell was she doing? It was not a question so much as the sound of a man beginning to realize how large a shape he had been walking around on without seeing. By the end of the second week, the scope of what Elowen had been managing inside his legitimate empire had become, if not fully clear, at least roughly visible in outline. The hotel portfolio, a web of commercial real estate agreements, 3 long-standing relationships with rival organization representatives that had, as far as anyone could determine, been Elowen's personal relationships maintained through dinners she attended as Cassian's wife, conversations she was trusted to have because the other parties thought of her as a social figure rather than an operative. She had not been operating as a spy. She had not been gathering intelligence against him. She had been doing what she apparently found natural, which was making complicated systems more stable through the application of intelligence and patience and the willingness to pay attention that Cassian so obviously lacked. 3 of those relationships were now in jeopardy. 2 commercial agreements had quietly expired without renewal discussions. The hotel portfolio was operating without a strategic direction, and the gaps were beginning to show in quarterly numbers. Marcus delivered these reports with his customary lack of drama. He had been with Cassian long enough to know when to keep his face entirely expressionless. "I need her found," Cassian said. "I understand she doesn't want to be found. I'm not asking you to drag her back here. I need to know she's safe." "She's safe," Marcus said carefully. "She's been safe. She's been careful, not hiding from danger. She's hiding from you. I know the difference. Do you want to contact her? Because there are ways to leave a door open without—" "She left her wedding ring on the dresser," Cassian said. Marcus stopped talking. "She's not interested in a door," Cassian said. "Not yet." He picked up one of the quarterly reports from the desk and turned it over in his hands without reading it. "What I need to know is whether she's being watched. By anyone who isn't me." Marcus was quiet for a beat too long. Cassian looked up. "Tell me. There's been some unusual movement around a few of the compromised deals," Marcus said slowly. "The kind of inquiry that doesn't come from lawyers or accountants. It comes from someone building a picture. Who? I don't have a name yet. I have a pattern." Marcus put a folder on the desk. "Whoever it is, they've been moving for longer than 2 weeks." This started before Elowen left. Cassian opened the folder. He read. The room was very quiet. The name that emerged from Marcus's investigation over the following 5 days was Gideon Rusk. Cassian knew the name the way you know, the name of a storm that formed somewhere far away and has been moving slowly in your direction for a long, long time. Rusk operated out of Milwaukee primarily, with interests that extended into Chicago's northern districts. He was organized, patient, and had spent the better part of a decade carefully avoiding direct confrontation with Cassian's operation. Not out of respect, out of strategy. Rusk did not fight battles he wasn't certain of winning. What Marcus uncovered, and it took Marcus's full capacity and 3 outside consultants and still took 5 days, was that Rusk had not been waiting. he had been building, quietly, methodically, over the course of nearly 2 years. He had been constructing the conditions for a takeover of Cassian's legitimate holdings, using the kind of financial erosion that left no visible damage until the structure simply stopped holding weight. And the information Rusk had been using to build this campaign had come from somewhere inside. Cassian read through Marcus's documentation with the particular focused attention he reserved for things that truly mattered. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He read every page, and then he went back and read certain pages again. When he was finished, he set the folder down and said, "Sabine." Marcus said nothing. "Tell me I'm wrong," Cassian said. "I can't tell you that. Tell me how long." Marcus picked up the folder and turned to a specific page. He placed it in front of Cassian and pointed to a date at the top. 22 months. Cassian looked at the date for a long time. 22 months ago he had still been. He did the calculation without wanting to. He had still been the man who answered Sabine's calls, who left dinner tables, who believed, in whatever compromised way, that whatever Sabine needed constituted an emergency. For 22 months, every time Sabine had called with an emergency, she had been providing Rusks with information, positioning data, meeting locations, the names of Cassian's commercial contacts, the structure of deals in progress. Every emergency had been a reporting session. He thought about the night 2 weeks ago. Elowen's face across the table, steady and terrified at once, saying the words she had saved for 11 weeks. His phone ringing, his hand reaching for it without thought, because reaching for it when Sabine called had become automatic, had been made automatic over 22 months of manufactured crises. He had walked out of the most important moment of his marriage to go report for duty to a woman who was feeding his coordinates to his enemy. He pressed both hands flat against the surface of the desk. "Where is she now?" he said. His voice was very controlled. That was always the danger sign, with Cassian not volume, but control. The Gold Coast apartment. Same place. Pull her access to anything connected to my accounts. Everything. Financial access, building codes, contacts everything she's ever had a key to. He paused. "And Marcus?" "Yes. I want to know if Rusk knows about Elowen." He said it quietly, but the words hit the air with weight. "I want to know if he knows she's pregnant, and I want to know if he's made any moves toward finding her." Marcus's expression did not change, but Cassian had known the man long enough to read what was underneath the stillness. "He knows," Marcus said. The air in the room changed. "How much does he know?" "He knows she's pregnant. He knows she left. He knows." Marcus stopped. He picked his next words with the kind of care a person uses when they're delivering news that has genuine consequences. "He knows she understood your legitimate financial structure better than anyone in your organization. Which means she knows where the pressure points are. Which means she is, from Rusk's perspective, a resource." Cassian stood up. "Or a problem," he said. "Yes," Marcus said. "Or that." Elowen was 19 weeks pregnant when she first noticed the car. It wasn't the first time she'd seen it. That was the problem. It was a gray sedan, nondescript to the point of invisibility, parked on the street opposite the property she'd rented in a quiet residential neighborhood on Chicago's northwest edge. She had relocated from the lakeside property 6 weeks earlier, after she'd noticed that the address was in her financial records in a way that felt too accessible. She was careful. She had always been careful. But she had not been careful enough, or perhaps she had been careful in the right ways for the wrong threat. She had been hiding from Cassian's reach. She had not fully calculated for the possibility that someone else might be looking. She first noticed the gray sedan on a Tuesday. She dismissed it. She noticed it again on Thursday, in a slightly different position, same street. She started paying attention. She was 19 weeks pregnant, and her back hurt, and she had a conference call with a new consulting client in 40 minutes, and she stood at the edge of her front window, looking at a gray sedan on a Tuesday afternoon, and felt the particular cold settling that comes with the recognition that your situation has changed in a way you did not plan for. She did not call Cassian. She called Mara Sloan instead. Mara was a private investigator she had hired 3 months before she left, before she had made the decision to leave, during the period when she was still building the architecture of her exit. Mara came recommended through a circuitous professional route, someone who did good work and kept her mouth shut, or so Elowen had been told. She had been using Mara to document several things: financial irregularities she'd noticed in Cassian's commercial dealings, names that appeared in paperwork in ways that didn't quite make sense, patterns she couldn't fully interpret from inside the marriage without outside assistance. She called Mara and described the sedan. She gave the license plate number, which she had photographed discreetly with her phone. Mara said she'd run it. Mara called back 40 minutes later, after the conference call, and said the plate was registered to a logistics company with a Milwaukee address. Milwaukee. Elowen sat down. She thought about what she knew about Cassian's world, which was more than most people would have guessed, and probably more than Cassian realized. She had been paying attention for 6 years. You don't sit beside a man in the world Cassian operated in for 6 years without absorbing the geography of the threats around him, even if no one thinks to brief you. Milwaukee, a logistics company. She turned it over and thought about the names she'd seen in documents over the years, the ones that appeared in slightly unusual contexts, the ones that Cassian's team seemed to track with more attention than the others. Gideon Rusk's. She did not know the name well. She knew it the way you know the name of a storm, not the details of its formation, but its general direction. She called Mara back. "I need you to find out what you can about a name," she said. Gideon Rusk. Milwaukee-based, significant interests in Chicago. "I want to know if he has people watching this address, and I want to know why." Mara said she'd look into it. "How long?" Elowen said. 48 hours. Maybe less. Okay. Elowen stood at the window again, not touching the curtain, watching the street from an angle. The sedan was still there. "Be thorough," she said. "And Mara, don't discuss this with anyone. Not your office, not your other clients." "No one." "Of course," Mara said. Elowen hung up. She made herself eat dinner. She answered 3 emails from the consulting client. She ran a bath and lay in it until the water cooled and the baby really moved. Not a suggestion this time, but a genuine deliberate push against the inside of her. Small and emphatic, and she pressed her hand against her stomach and felt the movement answer. "I know," she said, to no one. She dried off. She checked the locks on every door and window. She moved her laptop to the interior bedroom, the one without street-facing windows. She set her phone to alert her if the exterior camera she'd installed caught motion after midnight. She did not sleep well. The motion alert didn't go off. She was awake at 5:30 anyway, already sitting at her laptop, already working, already thinking 3 moves ahead. Because that was what Elowen Veyr did when she was frightened. She did not freeze. She did not unravel. She planned. The 48 hours Mara had promised turned into 60, then 72. Elowen called twice. The first call went to voicemail. The second was answered, but Mara sounded distracted, speaking in the clipped tones of someone who was present in body, but somewhere else in mind. "I'm still working it," Mara said. "What have you found so far?" "Nothing solid enough to give you yet. Give me until end of day." "The sedan was back this morning," Elowen said. "A beat. Then I'll call you by 6. She didn't call by 6. She didn't call at all. And by the time Elowen had spent another sleepless night waiting for a callback from a private investigator who had gone suddenly and completely quiet, she began to understand that the problem was not only the gray sedan parked on her street. The problem might also be the woman she had hired to help her investigate it. She opened her laptop. She started working through every document she had shared with Mara Sloan over the past 3 months. Every piece of information about Cassian's financial structure. Every name, every deal, every pattern she had identified and described out loud in the course of their working conversations. She sat in the interior bedroom with her laptop open and her hand pressed flat against her stomach, and she read back through 3 months of her own meticulous notes, and she felt the cold settle in deeper and deeper as the picture assembled itself. If Mara was working for Rusk, and by 3 in the morning, Elowen was no longer operating on if then Rusk's had, for 3 months. been receiving detailed explanations of the legitimate financial infrastructure of Cassian Veyr commercial empire, delivered willingly and in good faith by the one person alive who understood it completely. By Elowen herself, she had, without knowing it, been working against her husband. She pressed her hand harder against her stomach. The baby shifted. She stayed very still. The magnitude of what she was holding sat in the room with her like something with mass. She could call Cassian. The thought arrived clearly and immediately, and she acknowledged it and set it aside. She could call Cassian and tell him what she had found, and he would send people, and the problem would be handled in the way Cassian handled problems, which was to say completely and without asking her opinion about any part of the process. She would be installed somewhere safe. She would be managed. She would be the pregnant wife in protective custody, the civilian, who had stumbled into something too large for her. She had spent 6 years being that. She opened a new document on her laptop and began writing. Not because she had a plan yet, because she needed to think, and she had always thought best in written form. She wrote what she knew. She wrote the timeline. She wrote the shape of the problem as she understood it. And by 4 a.m, the outline of something was beginning to come clear, not a plan exactly, but a direction. A way through that did not require her to hand the wheel to Cassian and sit in the back seat and trust that someone who had never truly paid attention to her was now suddenly going to pay the right kind of attention. She was not going to call Cassian. Not yet. She was going to find out exactly how deeply Mara had compromised her. And she was going to build a counter before Rusk could use what he had. And she was going to do it herself, because she had earned the right to finish what she'd started. The baby moved again, stronger this time. Elowen looked at the dark window of the interior room, the one with no view of the street. She had left a marriage to protect this child. She had built a life, piece by piece, from nothing but her own intelligence and the money she had saved, in an envelope inside a book. She had done it pregnant and alone, and without asking anyone for help. And it had been the hardest and most clarifying thing she had ever done. She was not going back to being the woman behind the man. She was not going back to being the wife who waited. But she was also not, she now understood, someone who could simply disappear and wait for the storm to pass. Because the storm had found her. The storm had been finding her for 3 months, and she had given it detailed directions without even knowing. She closed the laptop. She lay down on the bed. She stared at the ceiling. There was no clean way forward. There was no version of what came next that did not require her to walk back into the middle of something dangerous, without the cover of a husband's name to protect her, without the infrastructure of a marriage she had already left. She would have to do it as herself, Elowen Hart, not Veyr. Hart. Her hand rested on her stomach in the dark, and the child inside her was still, and the night outside was very quiet. And somewhere in Chicago, a man named Gideon Rusk was holding 3 months of her best thinking and using it to dismantle the world she had walked away from, and taking her down with it in the process. She could not afford to let him finish. She sat up. She opened the laptop again. She started to plan. She started with what she knew. The document on her laptop had grown to 11 pages by the time the sun came up, and none of it was guesswork. Elowen had spent 6 years inside a world that ran on information, and she had absorbed more of it than anyone had ever given her credit for. She listed everything she had shared with Mara Sloan. Every conversation, every document, every structural detail she had explained out loud during their working sessions. She organized it chronologically, and then reorganized it by category: financial structure, commercial relationships, property holdings, contract architecture, because she needed to see it the way Rusk would see it. She needed to understand what he had, and what he could build from it. What he had was significant. She sat with that reality for approximately 4 minutes, letting it be what it was without trying to minimize it. Then she moved on. The gray sedan had not been on the street when she checked at 6 a.m. It was back by 8:15. She photographed it again from the interior hallway, through a narrow angle that didn't require her to approach any window directly. Different driver this time, she could tell by the shoulder silhouette, broader than the previous days. They were rotating people, which meant they had enough personnel to rotate. Meant this was not a casual observation operation. She wrote that down too. By 9, she had a working hypothesis, and by 10, she had confirmed enough of it, through her own financial records, to feel certain. Rusk had not yet moved on the information Mara had provided. The commercial relationships she had managed for Cassian were still intact on paper, still showing as active in the documentation she had access to. Which meant Rusk was holding the information in reserve. He was building something larger, something that required the information to be deployed at a specific moment rather than immediately. She needed to know what that moment was. She needed to find Mara. She did not go out through the front door. The property had a rear access point through a shared utility corridor. She had identified it during her first week, the way she identified all exits in all spaces she spent time in. A habit she had developed during the marriage without quite realizing she was developing it. She wore a coat that was slightly too large and pulled her hair back and walked to the end of the block and caught a rideshare heading east. She was 20 weeks pregnant. She walked carefully because she had learned over the preceding weeks that there was a particular kind of back pain that ambushed her when she moved without thinking, a sharp protest from somewhere in her lower spine that dropped her to half speed without warning. She moved carefully and she thought about everything except the discomforts, and she kept her phone in her coat pocket with her hand around it. She had an address for Mara's office at a commercial suite in the Loop, on the 14th floor of a building that also housed a dentist, 2 law firms, and a financial planning company. She had never been there. Their meetings had always been in neutral locations, coffee shops, and hotel lobbies, at Elowen's preference. The office was closed. The suite was listed on the building directory as Sloan Investigations, but the frosted glass door was dark, and when Elowen pressed her ear to it, she heard nothing. She tried the handle. Locked. She stood in the hallway for a moment. A woman from the law firm across the corridor came out and looked at her with mild curiosity. "Do you know when Sloan Investigations is normally in?" Elowen asked. The woman thought about it. "I haven't seen anyone in there for about a week, actually. Usually there's at least a light on." Elowen thanked her and took the elevator back down. On the street, she stood on the sidewalk with November air, doing something unpleasant to the back of her neck, and thought about what a week of absence meant for a private investigator who had been actively employed. Could mean field work, extended surveillance, the kind that required you to go dark for stretches. It could mean personal emergency, or it could mean Mara had been paid out and cleared out in the way that people in Rusk's world got cleared out when they had finished being useful. That thought arrived with a cold precision that Elowen did not let herself dwell on. She filed it and moved. She had a cell number for Mara, the professional line, the one she'd always used. She also had, because she was Elowen and Elowen was thorough, a second number she had obtained during an early session when Mara had called her back from a different phone, and she had noted the number without mentioning it. She had never used it. She used it now. It rang 6 times. She was preparing herself for voicemail when it picked up. Silence. Not dead air she could hear breathing. "Mara," she said. "I know you're there." More silence. "I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm not calling to report you to anyone. I'm calling because I think you're scared, and I think you have good reason to be, and I think we might be in the same position." A long pause. Then a voice, rough in a way that suggested either crying or no sleep or both. "You shouldn't have called this number." "I know. I'm calling it anyway. They're watching your phones." "I know that too." Elowen kept her voice level. The back pain was making a move and she shifted her weight. "Who is watching them? Who do you think?" "Tell me what he has, Mara. Tell me what you gave him." The breathing on the other end changed pitch. Faster than effortfully controlled. "I can't talk on this line," Mara said. "Then tell me where you are, and I'll come to you." "You shouldn't. I am 20 weeks pregnant, and I have been targeted by a man who apparently has detailed notes on my husband's financial empire that I wrote myself while thinking I was being smart," Elowen said. "I am well past the point of being careful. Tell me where you are." The pause that followed was long enough that Elowen thought the call had dropped. Then Mara gave her an address. It was a sublet in Pilsen, a 2-room apartment on the 2nd floor of a building. that smelled aggressively of mildew and old cooking. Mara answered the door after 3 knocks, looked up and down the hallway, and stepped back to let Elowen in. She looked like she hadn't slept in 5 days. She probably hadn't. She was still dressed, shoes on, jacket zipped, like someone who might need to leave quickly and didn't want to waste time on preparation. There was a laptop open on the kitchen table, and the blinds were all shut. Elowen came in and stood in the center of the room and looked at Mara with the particular expression she reserved for situations that required her to be entirely unreadable. "Talk," she said. Mara sat down at the table. She ran both hands through her hair, which needed washing. "It started before you hired me," she said. "I want you to understand that. Rusk approached me 4 months before you made contact. He knew I was looking for an investigator. He knew you were moving toward something. He had sources inside your inside Cassian circle who reported that you were becoming operational." That's the word they used. Operational. She looked up. "They were watching you before you started watching them." Elowen absorbed this. She had built her exit so carefully, and the discomfort of learning that she had been identified before she even began was genuine and sharp. She did not show it. "What were your instructions?" "Take whatever work you offered. Report the content of our conversations." Full transcripts. Mara's voice was flat, the way voices get when people are trying to report facts without having to feel them. "I wasn't supposed to direct anything. Just receive and report." "And you gave him transcripts of everything?" "Yes." "How many sessions?" 14. "Over 3 months." 14 sessions. Elowen thought about 14 sessions. She thought about the precision and comprehensiveness with which she had explained, across those 14 sessions, the financial architecture of Cassian's legitimate empire. She had been thorough. She was always thorough. "What is he building with it?" she said. Mara looked at her. For a moment, the exhaustion in her face gave way to something else, something closer to genuine fear. "He's not building anything," Mara said. "He's already built it." What Rusk had built, as Mara explained it in a flat, rapid voice that occasionally stumbled over details, was a case. Not a strategy for commercial takeover, a federal case. He had used the financial information Elowen provided to construct a paper trail, not against Cassian, not directly. Against Elowen, a shell company had been created under her maiden name, Hart, with documentation backdated to appear 18 months old. The shell company showed as the recipient of transfers from 3 of the legitimate hotel properties. Transfers that on paper looked like the laundering of Cassian's criminal revenue through the commercial structure. The shell company documentation had been crafted with the specific details. Elowen had provided account structures, property codes, contract numbers that only appeared in internal documents she had described to Mara. The information she had given was so precise, so specific and accurate, that anyone looking at the shell company documentation would find it corroborated by real records at every turn. The fabricated case looked real because it was built from real bones. Mara stopped talking. Elowen stood very still. "He filed it," Mara said. "Federal. 3 days ago. I got confirmation yesterday." She paused. "That's why I went dark. I knew it was coming and I didn't know how to—" "A federal case," Elowen said. "Money laundering. Use of a shell entity to transfer criminal proceeds. They have the shell company documents, and they have transaction records that match the descriptions you gave me in Session 7 and Session 11. Mara put her head in her hands. "I'm sorry. I need you to know that I stop." Elowen said it without anger. She said it because she needed Mara functional, not collapsed, and an apology was not functional. "I need to understand the timeline. If the filing was 3 days ago, what's the expected move?" Mara looked up. "Investigation opens formally this week. You'd expect contact subpoena, interview request within 30 days. But it could be faster if they decide to move on asset. On the pregnancy, she's your yes. Pregnant woman who appears to have been the financial operator of a criminal enterprise and who has recently disappeared from her husband's residence." Mara's voice was mechanical now, quoting back the framing she clearly knew well. "Makes you look like a flight risk. I left my husband. I didn't flee a federal case that didn't exist yet when I left. I know that, but it doesn't look that way. No, Mara said. It doesn't. Elowen walked to the window. She didn't open the blinds. She stood with her back to Mara and her hand against her stomach, and she stared at the thin line of light along the edge of the window frame. She had walked out of her marriage to protect her child. She had built an exit so careful and clean that Cassian had spent 2 weeks unable to find her. She had been running her own consulting work, building her own financial foundation, handling her prenatal care alone, managing a surveillance threat she hadn't been prepared for, and all of it, had taken place inside a trap she had walked into while thinking she was escaping one. She felt something move through her that was not quite rage and not quite grief. It was more like the feeling of a structure giving way the sensation of understanding that the ground you have been standing on was never actually solid. She turned back around. "What do you have on Rusk?" she said. Mara blinked. "You worked for him. You received payment. You received instructions. What documentation exists of that relationship?" Mara stopped. She looked at Elowen with the expression of someone who has been thinking of themselves as complicit and has not yet considered that complicity might be convertible. Mara. Elowen moved to the table and sat down. Her back was screaming at her. She ignored it. "He paid you for 3 months of work. How wire transfers to a business account? With documentation on his end. It would have to have documentation on his end. Yes. And your communications. Instructions, briefings, confirmation of deliverables. Encrypted channel. But I have copies. Why do you have copies?" A long pause. "Because I'm not stupid," Mara said quietly. "Because people who work for Gideon Rusk don't tend to have long retirements, and I wanted something I could use if I needed to." Elowen looked at her steadily. "Then you have something." "What I have isn't organized. It's not something you could walk into a federal building with tomorrow. I'm not going anywhere tomorrow. I'm 20 weeks pregnant, and I have a federal case filed under my name, and I am sitting in a mildew apartment in Pilsen talking to the person who put me here." She said it without cruelty, just precision. "Tell me exactly what you have. Everything. Documents, communications, payment records. Tell me what form they're in and where they're stored." Mara stared at her. "He's going to clean this up," Elowen said. "Whatever he decides to do with the federal case once it starts moving, you become a liability the moment it does. You know that. You've known that since you went dark." She paused. "You have leverage right now. In 3 weeks you may not." The silence in the room was very dense. Then Mara reached across the table and pulled the laptop toward her. She opened a folder. Elowen spent 2 hours in that apartment. She took photographs of every document on Mara's screen with her phone. She made Mara walk her through the communication records, the payment trail, the operational structure of the instruction chain. She asked questions with the focused precision of someone who has spent years understanding how financial documentation tells stories, and she listened to the answers with her entire attention. And she built a picture in her mind that was detailed and damning, and, most importantly, organized. She did not tell Mara what she intended to do with it. She did not tell Mara she intended to do anything. She said she needed time to think. She told Mara to stay put, to not contact Rusk, to not contact anyone. She said it without threat, in a tone that was closer to instruction than plea. Mara, who was clearly both frightened and depleted, nodded. Elowen put her coat on and left. She took 3 different routes back to the Northwest apartment, switching rideshare services twice and walking 2 blocks in the middle. She moved carefully, not quickly. The back pain had reached a plateau she could manage if she didn't push against it. By the time she got home, the sun was already angling low, and the interior bedroom felt smaller than usual. She sat at the desk. She looked at what she had photographed. Then she looked at the document she had started building. At 4 in the morning, the 11-page timeline and analysis, and she felt the shape of the problem change in her hands. It was still enormous. It was still, in several important ways, worse than it had been 12 hours ago. But it had a different shape than before. Before, it had been a problem of information. Rusk had it, and she didn't. Now she had a counterstructure. Not a complete one. Not yet, but the bones of one. The question was whether she could build it fast enough, and whether she could build it alone. She sat with that question for a long time. The honest answer was no. She could not build it fast enough alone. She did not like the honest answer. She turned it over and looked at it from several directions, trying to find an angle where it changed, and it didn't change. The federal case was filed. The clock was running. She had documentation that could challenge Rusk's fabrication, but documentation alone, unorganized and held by a single pregnant woman in a rented apartment, was not a counter-strategy. It was raw material. To build it into something that could actually function, something that could reach a federal investigator in a credible form, that could dismantle the shell company documentation with enough specificity to make the fabrication visible. She needed resources she didn't have. She needed infrastructure. The only infrastructure she knew that was large enough and motivated enough was Cassian's. She stared at her phone. She thought about the dinner, the note on the dresser, the ring she had left beside it. The decision she had made at 4 a.m. 6 weeks ago, with her hand on her stomach and her eyes on the road. She thought about what it would mean to call him, not as a wife calling a husband, not as a woman in distress reaching for the nearest available rescue. She thought about what it would mean to call him as the only person alive who actually understood what Rusk had built and why, and how to take it apart. She thought about what she needed from him, specifically and practically, and what she was and was not willing to accept in return. She picked up the phone. She put it down. She stood up and went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water and stood at the counter with both hands flat on the surface, very still, the way she went still when she was working through something she needed to fully understand before she moved. The child shifted, a slow roll, more purposeful than the early movements, the kind of movement that carried weight now. Elowen pressed one hand to her stomach. There was a federal case filed under her name. There was a man in Milwaukee who knew she was pregnant and who had used her own intelligence against her to fabricate it. There was a private investigator in Pilsen sitting on evidence that could unravel the fabrication, but who might decide to run at any moment, or who might already have been found by Rusk's people. There was a gray sedan that appeared on her street with rotating drivers. There was her own consulting income and her own savings and her own mind, which were significant resources, but which were not sufficient to this problem without backup. She needed Cassian. She was furious about needing Cassian. She picked up the phone again. She held it. Then she thought about something specific, not the marriage, not the dinner, not the ring on the dresser, but something Mara had said. They were watching you before you started watching them. They saw you becoming operational. Rusk had people inside Cassian's circle who had watched Elowen's movements months before she acted, which meant Cassian's organization was penetrated, which meant calling Cassian on any line that connected back to his world was a risk. Not because she didn't trust Cassian, she had moved well past, worrying about whether she trusted Cassian, but because Rusk had ears inside his operation, and if word reached Rusk that Elowen was moving toward Cassian, Rusk would accelerate. She could not call Cassian, not through any channel Rusk might be monitoring. She needed a clean line, a route that didn't touch anything in Cassian's existing world. She sat down at the desk again. She thought about the people she knew outside Cassian's world. Her consulting clients too new, too exposed. Old colleagues from before the marriage she had lost those connections. Slowly over 6 years, the gradual erosion of a woman who had prioritized a marriage at the expense of her own network. She thought for a long time. Then she thought of a name. Daniel Yeo. Daniel was an attorney she had worked with intermittently for 3 years, not a criminal lawyer. A commercial one, someone who specialized in complex contract disputes and had been, on 2 occasions, genuinely useful to Cassian's legitimate holdings without being connected to anything else. He existed in the clean layer of Cassian's commercial world, which meant he knew Cassian but didn't work for Cassian, which meant Rusk probably hadn't bothered to monitor him. She found his cell number in an old contact list she kept in a personal cloud account. She called him. He answered on the second ring. "This is Elowen Hart," she said. "I need you to get a message to Cassian Veyr, not through his regular channels. In person if possible. Today if possible." A pause that contained several things: surprise, calculation, professional caution. "Elowen," he said carefully, "is everything. I need you to tell him that the threat is larger than he currently understands, and that it has a federal component with my name on it. I need him to know that I have counter-documentation, but it requires immediate organization and a secure meeting location. Tell him I am not asking to come home. Tell him I am asking for a working meeting between two people who have a problem in common." She paused. "Can you do that?" A longer pause. "Yes," Daniel said. "I can do that today. I'll go to him directly." "Thank you." She almost hung up. Then Daniel, "Do not discuss this with anyone on Cassian's staff. Go to him personally, no calls." "In person." "Understood." She ended the call. She set the phone down. She sat in the quiet of the interior room with the shut blinds and the low desk lamp and the photograph of her mother on the windowsill and the presence of her daughter shifting slowly inside her. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost painful in its completeness, that she had just crossed a line she could not uncross. She was going back to Chicago, not to the marriage, not to the penthouse, not to the life she had packed a suitcase to leave. Not to being the wife who stood behind the man. She was going back to the problem, because the problem had found her regardless, and the only way through it now was through it. She would walk into Cassian Veyr's office as herself. She would put the evidence on his desk, and she would tell him, clearly and without apology, what the terms of her participation were. And if he couldn't meet those terms, she would find another way. But she was not going to sit in a rented apartment with a federal case building against her name and a gray sedan on her street and wait for someone else to decide happened to her and her child. She was done waiting. She had been done since the door clicked shut on a dinner she spent 3 hours making. She opened the laptop. She started building the evidence file she would carry. Into that meeting organized, sourced, cross-referenced, annotated, because if she was going to walk back into Cassian Veyr's world, she was going to walk in with something in her hands that made her indispensable. Not as a wife, as the only person in the room who fully understood what they were up against. Daniel Yeo delivered the message at 11:40 in the morning. Cassian was in the middle of a meeting with 2 lawyers, and Marcus when Daniel walked into the office unannounced, which was the kind of thing that did not happen, had never happened. In the 6 years Cassian had known Daniel, and so the mere fact of his presence in the doorway stopped the room completely before he said a single word. Cassian looked at him. Daniel looked back with the expression of a man carrying something heavy and trying not to show how heavy it was. "I need 5 minutes," Daniel said. Cassian dismissed the lawyers without looking away from Daniel's face. Marcus stayed. Cassian did not tell him to leave. Daniel came in and closed the door and delivered the message exactly as Elowen had given it to him. No editorializing, no interpretation, just the words. Federal component, her name on it, counter-documentation. Working meeting, not asking to come home. The room was very quiet when he finished. Marcus had gone absolutely still in the way he went still when he was cataloging information fast. Cassian had not moved at all. His hands were flat on the desk. His face gave nothing. "How did she sound?" he said. Daniel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Like herself," he said. "Controlled. But she called me on a cell number that isn't in general circulation, which tells you something about how carefully she's thinking about exposure. She's worried about our lines. She told me not to use any channel connected to your staff. Come to you in person." Cassian looked at Marcus. Marcus said quietly, "She knows about the penetration." "She may have gotten there from Rusk's direction," Cassian said, "or from her own investigation." He stood up. "How long ago did she call you?" 2 hours, Daniel said. Cassian was already reaching for his jacket. "Where are we meeting her?" Marcus said. "Where she says." Cassian turned to Daniel. "She didn't give you a location?" "She said to give her a place that isn't connected to you or your organization." Her words. Cassian thought for approximately 4 seconds. Then he gave Daniel an address, a commercial property in River North that had been purchased under a corporate name with no visible connection to the Veyr holdings. A building Cassian used for conversations he needed to have without a record. "Tell her 2 o'clock, he said. "Tell her to come in through the parking structure on the east side." Daniel nodded and left. Cassian stood in the office for a moment. Then he said to Marcus, "Pull everything we have on Gideon Rusk and federal activity in the last 30 days. Everything. I want it in the car. Already moving," Marcus said. He was already on his phone. Cassian picked up his jacket and put it on and paused at the window. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in November gray sky, hard wind off the lake, people on the street with their heads down and their shoulders up. He thought about Elowen sitting somewhere in this city with a federal case under her name and whatever she had managed to put together alone in an apartment with the blinds shut. He had spent the last 6 weeks trying to find her. He had spent the last 3 weeks understanding the dimensions of what she had actually been doing inside his empire, which had produced a specific and uncomfortable education in how thoroughly he had misunderstood the marriage he was in. He had spent the last 5 days sitting with intelligence about Rusk's operation that was growing more alarming with every new piece Marcus's team turned over. He had not slept well in 6 weeks. He put that aside. He walked out. She was already there when he arrived. He saw her before she saw him. She was standing near the far wall of the empty commercial space, coat on, a bag over one shoulder. She was looking at the door he hadn't come through yet because she was watching the main entrance, and he had come in from the parking structure side. For a moment he had an unobstructed view of her, and what he saw stopped him mid-step. She was visibly pregnant, not the barely there curve he might have noticed at the dinner table if he had been paying attention, which he hadn't been. This was undeniable, the full physical fact of a life at 20 weeks, her coat open in the front, her posture adjusted to carry the weight differently. She turned and saw him. Something moved across her face, not warmth, not anger, just a rapid and controlled assessment, the look she used when she was calibrating a situation. She was not glad to see him, or if she was, she had made a decision not to be. He walked across the empty room and stopped about 6 feet away from her. They looked at each other. There were many things that could have been said. 6 weeks of silence and separation and parallel damage. There were entire conversations that existed in the space between them. Conversations about the dinner and the ring and the note and the child he had not yet met in any real sense. All of that existed. Neither of them went near it. "You built a file," he said. "Yes." She reached into the bag and pulled out a tablet. The evidence file was already open. "Sit down. This is going to take a while." He sat. She stood. She walked him through it in the same precise, unflinching manner she apparently used for everything: the timeline of Mara's involvement, the specific sessions and their content, the structure of the shell company Rusk had created, the federal filing, the documentation from Mara's records that demonstrated the fabrication. She moved through it without pausing for his reactions, without softening anything, without the particular carefulness people often used when presenting bad news to Cassian Veyr. He said nothing. He looked at the documents when she indicated them, and he listened. When she finished, the room was quiet. The shell company documentation uses account code that only exists in internal property management records, she said. Codes I described to Mara in session 7 because she asked about the contract structure between the hotel properties and the commercial real estate holdings. Those codes don't appear in any public documentation. Rusk used them to make the fabrication look authenticated, which means the fabrication can be exposed by proving those codes were only ever accessible internally, Cassian said. Which means the federal investigators can verify that Rusk's documentation could not have been assembled such without inside access to your organization's internal records. She paused. Which means the question becomes how Rusk got inside access. And the answer to that question is Sabine. The name sat in the air. Cassian's jaw shifted. One small movement. "Tell me what you know about Sabine's role." "I know what Mara told me, which is what Rusk told Mara, which is limited but consistent with what your own intelligence team should have been finding." She set the tablet on a surface between them. Sabine has been reporting to Rusk for nearly 2 years. She had access to meeting content, personnel movements, the general shape of your commercial's dealings. Not detailed financial architecture. She didn't have that kind of access. But enough to help Rusk understand the landscape. We confirmed 22 months, Cassian said. Then you're ahead of me. She looked at him steadily. The detailed financial architecture came from me. From what I described to Mara. Rusk was building from 2 directions. Sabine gave him the geography, I gave him the specifics, and neither of us knew we were both sourcing the same operation. The flatness with which she said it, the complete absence of self-pity or performance, hit him harder than if she had been angry. I need to find Mara before Rusk does, Elowen said. She's in a sublet in Pilsen right now, but she's scared, and she has access to encrypted drives with payment records and communication logs. If Rusk determines she's a liability before we can secure what she has, we lose the counter documentation. Where exactly in Pilsen? She gave him the address. He sent a text to Marcus in 3 words. Marcus would handle the logistics. What else? Cassian said. She looked at him. For the first time he'd walked in, something fractured slightly in the surface of her expression. Not collapse, just a crack, briefly visible, the suggestion of how much this had cost her. I need to know, she said carefully, that when this is over, the counter-documentation goes to federal investigators through a channel that establishes my independent cooperation. Not your cooperation extended to cover me. Mine. You want your name on the resolution. I want my name cleared by my own action, not rescued by yours. He held her gaze, understood. I'm serious, Cassian. I know you're serious. If I walk back into this, if I do this with you, I am not your wife standing behind you. I am not the mother of your child being managed somewhere safe. I work alongside you, with full information, and any decision that involves me or this case goes through me first. Equal, he said. The word landed between them with weight, not the word itself, but the fact that he said it without hesitation, without negotiation, without the half-second pause she had learned over 6 years to watch for. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she gave him a short nod. They got to work. Marcus reached the Pilsen sublet in 40 minutes. Marcia was still there, which was the first piece of good news in several days. She was not, however, in the mental state Elowen had left her in 3 hours earlier. She had apparently spent the intervening time convincing herself that cooperating with Elowen had been a catastrophic mistake, and Marcus arrived to find her in the process of packing a duffel bag with the frantic energy of someone who had made decisions they hadn't quite committed to yet. Marcus was very good at this kind of situation. He stood in the doorway and waited until Mara registered his presence and stopped moving. Elowen Hart sent me, he said. She asked me to make sure you and your drives are somewhere that isn't this apartment. If you want to run, I can't stop you, but Rusk already knows this address. Mara stopped with a shirt half folded in her hands. How long has he known? She said. Long enough that you should not still be here. Marcus stepped into the apartment. The drives. Where are they? She stared at him for a moment, with the expression of a person doing very fast mental calculation about trust. Then she went to the kitchen, reached behind the refrigerator, and pulled out a brick of 2 encrypted drives taped together. Marcus took them carefully. Let's go, he said. By 4 in the afternoon, Cassian and Elowen were in a second location, a different property, this one with a full communications setup, and Marcus had joined them with the drives, and a concise summary of Mara's current condition, which was functional, frightened, and fully cooperative, now that the Pilsen address had been vacated. The drives required Mara's biometric confirmation to access. Mara provided it via a video connection Marcus had set up. Her hands were shaking slightly on the screen. The files that opened were not glamorous. They were what documentation always was, dense, organizational, the kind of thing that meant nothing to the untrained eye and everything to someone who knew what they were looking at. Elowen knew what she was looking at. She sat at the table with the drive's contents on a secured laptop, and she moved through the files with a focused speed that Marcus watched with undisguised attention. She pulled specific files, cross-referenced them against her own documentation, flagged communications between Mara and a contact she identified as Rusk's operational coordinator, not Rusk himself. One removed, which was how Rusk apparently preferred to work. Payment trail, she said without looking up. Wire transfers from a holding company called Meridian Transit Solutions. Milwaukee registration. The account number appears 3 times in communication logs as a confirmatory reference. She turned the laptop so Cassian could see. This is Rusk's money. The transfers to Mara are documented here, here, and here. The dates correlate exactly to the 14 session dates, she reported. Cassian looked at the screen. That's enough to establish Rusk's connection to the fabrication, Marcus said. That's enough to establish that he paid Mara for work that coincides with the information used to build the shell company. Combined with the internal account codes and the session transcripts, yes. It's enough. She paused. It's enough if it gets to the right federal investigator, in a form they can act on. Who's handling the filing? Cassian said. I don't have the case number yet. I need someone who can find out which office received the filing and who's assigned. Cassian looked at Marcus. An hour, Marcus said. He left the room. Elowen kept working. She built the counter documentation package, methodically an annotated summary of the fabrication's construction, cross-referenced with the drive contents and her own session notes, organized in the sequence a federal investigator would find most legible. She had done this kind of work before. Financial documents told stories to people who knew how to read them, and Elowen had spent years learning to read stories in numbers. Her back was doing something alarming by 5 o'clock. She shifted in the chair and kept moving. Cassian brought her water without being asked. She took it without commenting on the gesture. They worked. Marcus came back at 5:20 with a name and a problem. The name was the lead investigator on the federal case, a woman out of the Chicago field office, whom Marcus described in 2 sentences as sharp and not particularly sympathetic to anything that looked like an organized crime adjacent. Relationship, regardless of which side was talking. Problem was that Rusk had moved. He knows we're building a counter, Cassian said. It wasn't a question. He knows Mara is gone from the Pilsen address. That's enough. Marcus set his phone on the table. He's moving on the hotel, the flagship on Michigan Avenue. Our intelligence says he has people heading there now, not for violence. For the servers. Elowen looked up from the laptop. The original financial servers, she said. If he gets to them before we do, he can modify the transaction records that contradict his shell company documentation, Cassian said. He was already standing. He's going to erase the internal account codes, Elowen said. She was on her feet. If those codes don't exist in the original records, we can't prove the shell company documentation was built from internal data. The counter documentation falls apart. How long do we have? Cassian said to Marcus. His people left from the north side. 40 minutes, maybe less. We need to get there first. He looked at Elowen. She was already pulling her coat on. Elowen, don't. She said it, without heat, but with absolute finality. Don't tell me to stay here. He looked at her. She was 20 weeks pregnant, and she had been awake for what appeared to be most of the last 40 hours, and she was standing across from him with her jaw set and her eyes steady, and the coat half on and the tablet under her arm. He looked at her for exactly as long as it took to understand that this was not a negotiation. Stay close to me, he said. I'm driving myself. Elowen, I'll follow your car, but I'm driving myself. They moved. The hotel was 31 floors, and the server infrastructure lived on the 3rd floor in a climate-controlled room that required keyed access. Cassian had the key. He had the key because Elowen, 2 years earlier, had recommended that he maintain direct physical access to the primary financial servers as part of a security structure she had built for him that he had approved without fully reading. He thought about that as they moved through the lobby. The hotel was operating normally, guests moving through, a conference happening on the 2nd floor, the ordinary organized motion of a functioning building. Cassian moved through it with the 2 men he had brought, Marcus just behind him, Elowen 3 steps back and keeping pace. He could hear her breathing. It was controlled. She was controlling it deliberately, the way people breathe when they're in pain and not saying so. 3rd floor corridor. The server room door was at the end of it gray metal, keypad, the kind of institutional neutrality that made it invisible to anyone who didn't know what was behind it. It was open. The door was standing 2 inches open. Cassian stopped. Everyone stopped. The corridor was empty, fluorescent lit, entirely quiet except for the ambient hum of climate control. He turned to Marcus and communicated in the shorthand of long practice a look, small hand gesture. Marcus moved to the left with one of the men. The other man moved to flank the door from the right. Cassian went in. The server room was cold, the way those rooms always were. The equipment ran in rows indicator lights, blinking their steady status in the dark. 2 people inside one of them working at a terminal, fingers on a keyboard, moving fast. The other one standing near the door, and this one registered Cassian before his colleague did and reached inside his jacket. Cassian's man was faster. The one at the terminal stood up abruptly and turned, and for a moment the 4 of them were in the room together in the particular suspended second before a situation becomes irrevocable. "Step away from the terminal," Cassian said. The man at the terminal, young, mid-30s, the specific blankness of face that came from training rather than nature, looked at the man on the floor and at Cassian's people and executed the mental calculation of his options in about 2 seconds. He stepped away from the terminal. "Put your hands where I can see them." He did. Cassian moved to the terminal. He looked at the screen. They had been fast. 3 minutes, maybe 4, they'd had a head start, and they had been moving with professional efficiency. 2 entries in the transaction record had already been modified. He could see the edit log, could see the timestamps. He pulled out his phone and called the hotel's IT director, a man named Huang, who answered on the second ring because calls from Cassian's personal number were not the kind you let go to voicemail. "Server room, 3rd floor," Cassian said. "I need you here now, and I need you to restore from backup going back 30 minutes. Don't ask me anything. Just get here." He ended the call. He looked at the 2 men Marcus was managing. Then Elowen was in the doorway. She had not stayed in the corridor. He was not surprised. She came in and looked at the terminal and looked at the edit log and looked at the timestamps and said, "Which records?" He showed her. She leaned over the terminal, one hand braced on the desk, one hand holding the edge of the screen, and looked at the modified entries with the focused attention of someone reading something that matters. They got to 2 of the 3 reference points, she said. The 3rd one, account code 4471C, is still intact, she pointed. That's the most specific code, the one that appears nowhere in public records and only in the contract annex from 2021. If we restore the other 2 from backup and the 3rd one is intact, the counter documentation holds. She stood back up. She put her hand on her lower back. Just briefly, just for a second, before she straightened. Cassian watched her do it. Huang arrived 7 minutes later, sweating and wide-eyed, and spent the next 11 minutes restoring the server from backup, while Cassian stood behind him and Elowen sat in a chair someone had found for her and talked Huang through exactly which records needed verification once the restore was complete. Huang kept glancing at her stomach, and then at Cassian, and then back at his screen. Nobody said anything about any of it. The restore completed. Elowen cross-referenced the restored records against her documentation on the tablet. Her fingers moved over the screen with the steadiness of someone who has decided that hands are not allowed to shake yet. "It's intact," she said. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." The room let out a breath it had apparently been holding for the past 20 minutes. Then Marcus's phone went off. He looked at it. He looked at Cassian. Rusk just found out his people got stopped at the server room. He paused. "He's in the building." Elowen looked up. Cassian looked at Marcus. "Where lobby to elevator as of 2 minutes ago." Marcus's voice had the careful flatness of someone calibrating how bad the news actually was. "He's coming up." The server room was very quiet. Elowen set the tablet down on the desk beside the terminal. Stood up straight. The back pain was writ in the set of her shoulders, but her face was composed and focused and absolutely, implacably present. "He doesn't know what we've already restored," she said. "He doesn't know what we have." She looked at Cassian. He's coming up here because he thinks he still has leverage. He might, Marcus said. He doesn't, Elowen said. Not anymore. She reached for the tablet. Let him come. Cassian looked at her. He had known this woman for 7 years. He had been married to her for 6. He had sat across dinner tables from her and slept beside her and watched her navigate his world with a grace and intelligence he had absorbed without ever acknowledging. And he was looking at her now in a cold server room on the 3rd floor of his flagship hotel, 20 weeks pregnant and braced against a desk and staring at the door with the expression of someone who has decided what they are and what they are willing to do. And he understood, with a clarity that cost him something significant, that he had never actually seen her before this moment. The elevator at the end of the corridor made its sound. The doors opened. Footsteps in the hallway, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who believes he controls the room he is walking toward. Elowen straightened. She moved toward the server room door. Cassian moved with her, 1 step to her left, close enough to be present without being in front of her, not placing himself between her and the hallway, not running interference. Just there, positioned beside her the way you stand, beside someone you have finally understood is capable of standing. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A man filled the doorframe. Gideon Rusk was in his early 50s, broad across the shoulders, with the composed face of someone who had spent decades being the most dangerous person in most rooms. He looked at Cassian first, a quick appraisal, professional and cold. Then he looked at Elowen. Something shifted in his expression. Not fear, something more calculated than fear. He had not expected her to be here. He had not expected her to be standing. Mrs. Veyr, he said. He used the name with the specific precision of a man indicating that he has done his research. Hart, she said. Elowen Hart. He looked at her. She held his gaze and did not look away, and did not look at Cassian, and did not look at the door or the floor or anything except Rusk's face. I think you've been operating on incomplete information, she said, about what I've been building for the past 48 hours. I'd like to correct that. Rusk tilted his head slightly. The composed face did not change, but his eyes moved, just briefly, to the terminal behind her, and then to the tablet in her hand, and in that brief involuntary movement, Elowen read exactly what she needed to read. He was calculating, which meant he wasn't certain. Which meant he still thought there was a version of this that worked for him. Dense. She was going to show him there wasn't. She took 1 step forward, tablet in hand, and began to speak. She took 1 step forward and she started talking. Not loudly. That was the thing people who didn't know Elowen always got wrong when they imagined how a woman in her position would handle a moment like this. They imagined volume, imagined the release of everything that had been compressed over months of fear and exhaustion and fury into a single theatrical confrontation. That was not how Elowen worked. She had spent 6 years in rooms full of men who confused volume with authority, and she had learned not from Cassian, not from anyone who taught her deliberately, but from the accumulated education of paying attention that the most dangerous person in any room was usually the quietest one. She spoke at her normal register. She told Rusk what she had. She started with the Meridian Transit Solutions payment records. Because money was always the cleanest place to begin. Money left trails that couldn't be reinterpreted the way intentions could, the way conversations could, the way a woman's motivations could be framed and reframed, depending on who was doing the framing. She walked him through the 14 sessions with Mara, the content of each, the communication logs between Mara and Rusk's operational coordinator, not Rusk himself, 1 degree removed, which was how Rusk apparently preferred to operate. Which was actually useful because it meant the coordinator's name appeared in the documentation as a connective thread between Rusk's money and Mara's reporting. She walked him through the shell company structure, the account codes that appeared in the fabricated documentation codes that existed only in internal records she had personally described to Mara in session 7, because Mara had asked a specific question about the contract architecture between the hotel properties and the commercial real estate holdings. She walked him through the restored server records, the edit log that showed exactly his people what had been attempting to do in the 12 minutes before Cassian's team arrived, and what they had not managed to complete before those 12 minutes ran out. And then she told him about the cloud account. She described it the way she described everything precisely, without embellishment, without the dramatic pause that a less controlled person might have deployed to let the weight of it land. She described the time release structure, the 18-hour window, the specific field office and investigator name that were already written into the delivery instructions. She was not bluffing. He would know she was not bluffing, because everything else she had said was documentably true, and she had said all of it in the same tone. Rusk stood in the doorway of the server room, and he listened. He was good. She gave him that without resentment, the way you give credit to an opponent who has demonstrated genuine competence, even while using it against you. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and his face composed, and he absorbed everything she said without interrupting and without looking away. And the only indication that he was processing the magnitude of what he was hearing was the slight shift in his weight at the mention of the cloud account, some movement so small that most people in the room would have missed it. Elowen didn't miss it. When she finished, the server room held its particular silence, the ambient hum of climate-controlled equipment, the blink of indicator lights, the breathing of the people in it. Huang was staring at his terminal screen with the focused intentness of a man who had decided that absolute concentration on his own work was the most sensible policy available to him. "You built all of this in 48 hours, Rusk said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was the sound of a man recalibrating. "I had good material," Elowen said. "You gave me most of it." He looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't fully categorize. It wasn't respect, exactly. It was more like the particular attention a chess player gives to a move they hadn't seen coming, not emotional, just technical, the recalculation of a board that had shifted under their hands. "The federal case doesn't disappear because you have counter-documentation," he said. "That's not how federal cases work." "No," she agreed. "It becomes a different conversation right now. The case is about me. With what I have, the conversation becomes about you, the fabrication of federal evidence, the creation of fraudulent financial instruments under a false entity, and the coordinated use of a civilian intermediary to extract proprietary business information under false pretenses." She held his gaze without blinking. "Those are federal charges of a substantially different weight than the ones you filed against me." Rusk looked at Cassian. It was a brief look, just a flicker of redirection, the instinct to find the man in the room when a negotiation became uncomfortable. Cassian had not moved. He was standing one step to Elowen's left, with his hands loose and his face giving absolutely nothing, not stepping in, not positioning himself between her and Rusk, not doing any of the things a man in his position in his world typically did when things became pointed. He was just there, present, one step to her left. Rusk registered this. His eyes moved back to Elowen. "What do you want?" he said. He directed it at her. He had understood, in the past 6 minutes, who was running this. "I want the federal case withdrawn," she said. "I want the shell company dissolved, and the supporting fabricated documentation surrendered to the federal investigator as evidence of the fabrication. I want Mara Sloan's cooperation formalized with appropriate legal protection so her testimony is admissible and usable." She paused for exactly one beat. "And I want Sabisa Kessler's documented role in your operation submitted alongside yours." Composed surface cracked, just slightly. Just across the jaw, a tightening that he controlled within a second, but that was visible in that second to anyone watching. "Sabine is a private matter," he said. "Sabine is the mechanism by which you had access to this organization for 22 months, Elowen said. She is the foundation of the geographic intelligence that made your operation functional. She is not a private matter. She is a documented co-conspirator, and she will appear in the submission as one or this conversation ends right now, and the cloud account releases on its own schedule. She won't cooperate. She doesn't need to cooperate. Mara's communication records reference her by name across 11 entries spanning the full operational period. That's sufficient for the investigator to bring her in independently. Elowen's voice was even, unhurried, the voice of someone who has thought further ahead than the person they're talking to. I'm not asking you to hand her to anyone. I'm telling you she's already in the documentation. You don't have a choice about that part. Rusk was quiet. The equipment hummed. One of Cassian's men shifted his weight, and the small sound of it was very loud in the room. Rusk looked at the floor. It lasted 2 seconds. Maybe 3, a small and significant defeat, the look of a man revising what he thought his options were, and finding them smaller than he had believed when he stepped off that elevator. When he looked back up, his face was composed again, but the composition had a different quality now. Quality of someone who has accepted a loss and is calculating how to manage it rather than reverse it. I'll need 48 hours to arrange the legal process, he said. You have 24, Elowen said. The cloud account doesn't adjust for your timeline. He held her gaze for a long moment. She held his back without effort, without performance, without the particular physical strain that prolonged eye contact with someone like Rusk might reasonably produce in a person who had not spent months learning to maintain composure under pressure that would have dismantled most people entirely. He gave a single short nod. Then he turned and walked out of the server room. His footsteps went down the corridor. They were steady and unhurried. He would not give the indignity of a hasty retreat. The elevator opened at the end of the hall and closed, and the sound of it faded, and then the floor was quiet in a way it hadn't been since Cassian's people had first come through the server room door. Marcus let out a long breath through his nose. He said something very quiet that Elowen didn't catch and didn't try to. Huang typed something on his keyboards, with the exaggerated focus of a man committing to the fiction that he had been doing exactly this the entire time. Elowen turned back to the terminal. She pulled up the restored records one final time, not because she needed to verify them again. The verification was complete, but because her hands needed something to do, while the adrenaline that had been running through her for the past 20 minutes finished burning itself out. Her hands were steady on the keys. She noted this with the detached interest she brought to observing her own physical responses under stress. Steady. Good. Then the back pain came back. It had been waiting, patient and unkind, for the moment her attention released from the immediate. It arrived now with the full force of 2 days of inadequate rest and several hours of standing in a cold server room while 20 weeks pregnant, and it hit her lower back like something structural giving way. And she reached for the edge of the desk, with one hand without quite meaning to. Cassian was beside her before her hand reached the surface. Not grabbing, not taking over. His hand came under her elbow, steady present, calibrated to support without directing, which was a distinction she registered, even through the pain, because the distinction mattered. She didn't shake it off. She let herself lean into it for exactly the 3 seconds it took for the sharpest part of the pain to pass. Sit down, he said, quietly close to her ear, so it wasn't a command in the room but a request between two people. She sat in the chair someone had located from somewhere. She sat carefully, adjusting her position, until she found the angle that made the pain manageable, and she put her tablet on her knee and she looked at the screen and she breathed. Cassian crouched beside the chair so they were at eye level. It was such a simple thing. He just crouched there, beside the chair, so he wasn't standing over her. She looked at his face and found it open, in the way it had been open twice before. In all the years she had known him unmanaged, not composed, just what it was. Are you all right? He said. The baby's fine. I'm tired. She paused. It's been a long 2 days. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood and turned to Marcus and said quietly, Car at the south exit. Now. Already arranged, Marcus said. Rusk's legal team contacted the federal investigator's office within 19 hours. Daniel Yeo called Elowen at 6 in the morning with the update, speaking in the careful, measured tones of a lawyer who has good news but understands that good news in federal matters is never simple. The withdrawal request has been filed, he said. They've submitted the fabrication documentation concurrently. That's significant. It means they're not just withdrawing the case, they're actively cooperating with the counter-investigation. The investigator will want to meet with you. When? She suggested Thursday. I can push for Monday if you need more time. Thursday is fine, Elowen said. I'll be ready. She put the phone down and sat in the kitchen of the Northwest apartment she had gone back there. Because it was hers, because the thought of staying anywhere connected to Cassian's organization even logistically felt like a line she wasn't prepared to cross. Not yet, not while she was still processing the shape of what came next. She drank her tea. She looked at the morning light coming through the kitchen window, and she breathed in the particular quiet of early morning in an apartment that was entirely her own. The gray sedan was not on the street. She had checked at 5:45, before the call from Daniel, standing at the edge of the window with her tea in both hands. The street was empty in the way streets were empty before the city remembered to be busy. No gray sedan, no rotating drivers, no surveillance apparatus holding its patient position outside her life. She stayed at the window for longer than the check required. She was not looking for the car. She was looking at the absence of it, which was its own thing, the quiet where a threat had been, the ordinary street that was just a street again, the specific relief of understanding that you can go back to looking at the world without calculating who in it might be watching. Pressed one hand against her stomach. June moved. A long, deliberate push from the inside, the movement of someone with opinions, and the physical capacity to register them. I know, Elowen said. We got there. The meeting with federal investigator Caldwell lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. Caldwell was not what Elowen had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected. A woman in her mid-40s, with gray beginning at her temples, and the compressed, efficient energy of someone who had spent 2 decades listening to people lie. She sat across from Elowen and Daniel in a conference room in the federal building, and she's listened the way a person listened when they had fully suspended judgment in favor of information gathering, without nodding, without the social cues that people usually offered to signal. They were following along, just listening, her eyes moving between Elowen's face and the documentation on the table. She asked good questions, specific, targeted questions that pushed on the places where the documentation had gaps, and noted the places where it was airtight. She asked Elowen to walk her through the session structure with Mara, not the summary but the actual process. What information was exchanged, in what form, on what basis. She asked about the cloud account, its structure, when it had been set up, what instructions had been embedded in it. She did not ask Elowen how she felt about any of it. Elowen appreciated this. At the end of the 3 hours and 14 minutes, Caldwell gathered the documentation and was quiet for a moment, looking at the stack of it. Then she looked at Elowen. This is thorough, she said. Yes, Elowen said. The time release mechanism. You actually set that up and activated it before you entered the hotel. Yes, while you were also assembling the rest of this package. The timeline was compressed. I worked with what I had. Caldwell looked at her steadily for a moment. You were a financial strategist before your marriage? During my marriage, too, Elowen said, informally. Without credit or compensation. She said it without bitterness, just as fact. The informality of it created an intelligence gap that Rusk exploited. He didn't know I was the architect of the structures he was mapping. He thought he was gathering intelligence about Cassian's empire through me, not from me. Caldwell made a small sound. Then, don't leave the city. My office will be in contact within the week. She paused at the door. For what it's worth, she said, without turning around, the shell company documentation was convincing. The account codes, the transaction language whoever built it, had access to information that should have been completely internal. That specificity is going to be a significant part of the Rusk prosecution. I know, Elowen said. I wrote the original documentation those codes came from. Caldwell turned. She looked at Elowen. For one moment, a look that contained something Elowen couldn't fully name, somewhere between professional acknowledgement and something more personal. The look of a woman who has spent her career in rooms full of people who underestimated other women and has learned to recognize the specific texture of that underestimation's consequences. Then she left. Daniel turned to Elowen in the empty conference room. That went well, he said, in the careful tone of a lawyer who had been braced for significantly worse. Elowen looked at the table where the documentation had been. Yes, she said. It did. How are you feeling? She considered the question honestly. Her back hurt. She was tired in the way she had been tired for the past 3 months, not acutely, not dramatically, but in the deep accumulated way that came from operating at full capacity under sustained pressure while also growing a human being. She was also, underneath all of that, something that she took a moment to identify because she wasn't in the habit of checking for it. She was relieved. Not happy. Not done. But relieved in the way you were relieved when something you had been holding at full tension could finally, carefully, be allowed to ease. "I'll be all right," she said. "I just need to sleep for approximately 1 week." Daniel almost smiled. "I'll make sure my billing reflects that as a medical necessity." She did almost smile back. Sabine Kessler's name appeared in the federal documentation the way Elowen had known it would not through Rusk's voluntary disclosure, which was not something she had expected or required, but through the communication records Mata provided, which referenced Sabine across 11 separate entries spanning the operational period. The entries were specific enough, the references consistent enough across multiple documents and dates, that Caldwell's office was able to build an independent basis for investigation without requiring Rusk to hand anything over. Cassian did not intervene in this process. Updated, Elowen, because Marcus had apparently decided, without formal instruction from anyone, that keeping her informed was now part of the responsibilities he carried in the operational structure that had reformed itself around this crisis. She did not discourage this. Information was useful, and Marcus was reliable. She learned from Marcus that Cassian had also, within the week following the hotel confrontation, formally terminated every financial connection, legal relationship, and structural arrangement that existed in any documented form between Sabine Kessler and anything bearing his name or signature. The termination was thorough and irrevocable and had been executed through lawyers in a way that left no reopenable doors. He had not done this as a gesture toward Elowen. He had not announced it or presented it as evidence of change. Marcus mentioned it in the course of updating her on the broader situation and moved on, because it was, in Cassian's calculus, not a gift to be offered, but a correction to be made. Elowen sat with this information in the kitchen of the Northwest apartment with her tea going cold beside her, and she thought about Sabine Kessler for a long time. She thought about 6 years of dinners interrupted, and anniversaries shortened, and weekends derailed, and the specific particular weight of spending 6 years watching her husband's attention be commandeered by another woman's manufactured emergencies. She thought about the shape that weight had taken in her body over those years, the way she had learned to hold her jaw, the way she had practiced not reacting, the specific psychic labor of loving someone who is always half somewhere else. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about Sabine sitting in a federal interview room in the same building where Elowen had sat with Caldwell, and Daniel sitting across from investigators with the specific documentation of 22 months of her own decisions laid out on the table between them. Elowen felt very little, not satisfaction, not the catharsis that the narrative logic of the situation seemed to promise. Just a kind of tiredness at the enormous expenditure of attention she had given to a woman who had never, it turned out, been what she appeared to be in Elowen's imagination. Sabine's had not been a rival in any romantic sense. She had been an operative. The emergencies had been performances. The relationship Cassian believed he was maintaining had been an extraction operation, and every time he had answered the phone and left the table, he had been running toward the woman who was systematically dismantling him. There was something darkly clarifying about this. Not comforting, but clarifying. Elowen had spent 6 years competing in her own quiet way with someone who had never been competing back. Sabine had not wanted Cassian. She had wanted what Cassian's access provided. The intimacy had been instrumental, and Cassian, who prided himself on reading people and situations with a precision that his world required for survival, had been completely and thoroughly fooled. She did not take pleasure in this, but she did let herself finally set it down. Cassian came to the Northwest apartment 3 weeks after the hotel. He called first. The call came at 4 in the afternoon, and he said, simply, "I'd like to come for dinner if that's all right," not announcing. not assuming, asking. She said yes. He arrived at 7, with nothing in his hands, no wine, no flowers, none of the performance apparatus she had watched other men deploy when trying to make an impression. He came in and looked around the apartment with the careful attention of a man trying to understand something he hadn't been allowed to see before. Constructing from the furniture and the books on the shelf and the monitor clipped to the kitchen counter, the picture of a life that had been built entirely without him. The nursery door was open. He looked at it. "Can I?" he started. "Yes," she said, before he finished the sentence. He went in. She stood in the hallway and watched him stand in the room. She had built the soft yellow walls. She had painted herself on an afternoon in September with her hair up and an old shirt on, and the specific meditative satisfaction of a task that required physical work and produced a visible result. The crib she had assembled over 2 evenings, with the instruction manual spread on the floor and a flashlight propped at an angle because the overhead light in the room wasn't strong enough. The bookshelf she had filled with the books she wanted, read to her daughter, not the ones people gave as gifts, the ones she had chosen herself, the ones she remembered or had found and thought, "This is the right one. This is the right one for her." The rocking chair from the estate sale that she had stripped and refinished on the back walkway over 2 Saturdays, which Cassian's people had probably photographed from the street without understanding what they were looking at. Cassian stood in the center of the room. He touched the crib railing. One hand, lightly, the way you touched something you needed to understand, was real. His back was to her, and she could see the line of his shoulders, and the set of his neck, and the absolute stillness with which he was holding himself. She watched him for a long time. He turned around. His face was what it was, no management. The second time she had seen it clearly, and it was, even now, after everything, the face she had fallen in love with, not the composed face, not the controlled face, but the real one underneath, the one that existed before he had learned that showing it was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. "I'm sorry," he said. She had imagined this moment more times than she would admit. During the long nights of the Northwest apartment, during the prenatal appointments she attended alone, during the 3 in the morning hours when the baby's movement kept her awake, and she lay in the dark, running through every version of every conversation that was still unfinished between them. She had imagined what she would say, what it would feel like, whether there was any version of those 2 words that could carry what needed to be carried. She stood in the hallway for a moment. "I know," she said. He started to say something else. She could see it forming. The instinct to elaborate, to explain, to fill the silence with the content of what the apology contained. "I know," she said again before he could. "You don't need to inventory it for me." It was there. He stopped. "What I need," she said carefully, "is not an account. I need what you've been doing, the appointments, the availability, the not demanding anything. Keep doing that. That's what I need." He nodded, and when she's here, she paused. Put her hand against her stomach, where June was currently making a slow, thoughtful roll. She is never an afterthought. She is never the thing left at the table while you answer something else. Whatever is happening anywhere else in your life, she is always the first consideration. "Yes, I mean it. I know you mean it." He held her gaze. "So do I." She looked at him in the hallway light, this man she had loved and married, and spent 6 years building a life alongside, and then packed a suitcase away from. This man who had walked out of the most important dinner she had ever prepared, and who had then, imperfectly and slowly and without making a monument of it, tried to become someone different. "Okay," she said. She walked into the nursery and stood beside him, and they both looked at the crib, the soft yellow room, in the particular silence of people who have too much history to fill silence easily and have decided not to try. "Pick the name because of the light," she said. "June light. The way it comes in the mornings. The particular quality of it." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him beside her, not touching, just the physical presence of another person in the small room. "It's a good name," he said. "I know," she said. They stood there together for a while. Not touching, not performing comfort or reconciliation for an audience that wasn't present. Just 2 people in a small yellow room that smelled of paint and the particular cedar of the furniture, standing in the ordinary difficult space of a relationship that had broken and was in the process slowly and with no guarantee of being rebuilt into something with a different shape. The federal case against Elowen Hart was formally closed 11 weeks later. A letter arrived through Daniel's office, a physical letter on federal letterhead, indicating that the filing had been withdrawn and the investigation formally closed with no finding. The Krusk prosecution was proceeding, and she should expect to be contacted as a potential witness. Her cooperation to date had been noted and would be reflected in the court record. She read the letter twice. Then she put it in the file in the home office drawer between the prenatal documentation and the financial records from the consulting work she had been building since September, and she closed the drawer. That was all. She had expected to feel more. She had been carrying the weight of the federal case. For so long, the specific dense weight of having her name attached to a fabrication she hadn't made, that she had assumed its removal would produce something proportionate to its presence. A significant release. Something that felt like the lifting of the thing. What she felt instead was quieter than that. The drawer closed. She went to make lunch. She was 32 weeks pregnant, and her back was a persistent negotiation, and she had a conference call with a consulting client in 2 hours, and June was moving with the continuous commentary of a person who had fully settled into her convictions about the available space. Elowen made a sandwich and stood at the kitchen counter eating it and thought about nothing in particular, just the ordinary sequence of the afternoon, the call at 2, the errand she needed to run before 6, the new chapter of the book she was reading. The case was closed. It was done. She was still here. Cassian came to every appointment for the last 10 weeks of the pregnancy. Every scan, every routine check, every Tuesday morning, in the waiting room of the practice on Michigan Avenue, where Elowen had been seen since the beginning, where the receptionist knew her name and the OB had at some point stopped commenting on the fact that the person who now accompanied her was a different demographic entirely from the waiting room average, because the person accompanying her was visibly and completely present in a way that required no comment. He sat beside her. He did not bring his phone out. She said once, around week 34, that he could check it if he needed to, that she didn't need to be the reason his entire organization ground to a halt in a waiting room in Michigan Avenue. He said it could wait. She looked at him. He was not performing patience. She knew the difference by now, knew the particular quality of performed attention versus the real thing. He meant it. She looked back at the magazine she was reading. They sat in the waiting room in the ordinary quiet of two people who had decided announcing it to be decent to each other. He drove her home afterward and sometimes came up for coffee and sometimes did not, and she did not make either into a statement. When he came up, they talked about June, about the nursery, sometimes about the practical logistics of the life they were building toward, occasionally about the work each of them was doing, the legitimate restructuring of his holdings that he was moving through carefully and without rush, the consulting practice she was growing under her own name, with clients who knew her as Elowen Hart, and for whom the Veyr connection was not the primary credential. When he didn't come up, she went inside alone and made her tea and sat in the kitchen and was fine. Both were true. Both could be true at once. This was something she had learned in the Northwest apartment, in the months of building a life that contained only herself, that solitude and connection were not opposites, that choosing yourself was not the same as refusing everyone else, that it was possible to be whole and alone, and also to want company, and to want it with a particular person, and to hold all of those things at the same time, without any of them canceling the others out. June Veyr was born on a Thursday morning in late spring. It was not clean. 15 hours, and the fear that arrived around hour 11 was a specific and ancient kind of fear, the fear of a body doing something enormous and uncertain, the fear of being accountable for something that required everything and left nothing in reserve. Elowen had not expected the fear. She had prepared for the mechanics and the pain and the logistics, and the fear arrived underneath all of those preparations and was larger than any of them. Cassian was there for all 15 hours. He did not try to manage it or reduce it or translate it into something more comfortable. He was there in the chair beside the bed, and then standing at her shoulder, and then in whatever position she needed him in, moving when she needed him to move, and staying when she needed him to stay. He was there when she said, "Get out of my sight for 10 minutes," and he went to the hallway, and he was back in 9 minutes and 40 seconds, which she counted, because counting was something to do during contractions. He did not offer opinions about medical decisions. He did not leave the room, not for his phone, not for anything. When the nurse handed June to him for the first time, small and furious, and making her opinions known at full volume, Elowen watched his face from across the room. She was exhausted beyond any exhaustion she had previously catalogued, and she watched him receive his daughter, and she watched his face do what she had known it would do, and she felt something that was very complicated, and very tired, and very real. He went absolutely still. June was yelling, which was her right, which was the correct response to having arrived somewhere cold and bright after 9 months of perfect accommodation. She was yelling, and Cassian held her with the specific terrified care of someone holding something irreplaceable, and he looked at her face, the small, scrunched, furious face of a person who had opinions and the lung capacity to express them. And he went still in the way that people went still when something had fundamentally rearranged them. He looked across the room at Elowen. His phone was in his jacket pocket. It buzzed. She could see it, the slight vibration through the fabric, the brief mechanical interruption. He didn't look at it. He looked at Elowen. Then he reached into his pocket and switched the phone off. He walked to the chair beside her bed and sat down and held their daughter and looked at the two of them and said nothing at all, which was the right thing to say. 2 days later, in the quiet of the hospital room at night, with June asleep in the bassinet and the ward making its soft institutional sounds through the closed door, they sat in adjacent chairs and drank the terrible coffee the hospital provided and existed together in the particular exhaustion of people who have been through something enormous and are just beginning to understand the dimensions of what comes next. "Thank you," Elowen said, "for being there, for all of it." He looked at the coffee in his hands. "I should have been there for all of it from the beginning." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She didn't soften it. It was true. Softening it would have been a service to neither of them. But you were there for this part. She looked at June in the bassinet. At the small face, still and peaceful in sleep, hands fisted at her cheeks in the way of newborns who carry the posture of the womb with them into the world. "That matters," Elowen said. He was quiet for a moment. "Is it enough?" he said. Not plaintive, just asking. She looked at him. "It's a start," she said. He nodded once. He didn't push further. He understood that a start was what was available, and that making it into more than it was would not make it more. It would only make it less honest. They sat in the quiet and drank the coffee, and their daughter slept. October came. Chicago in October had its own particular quality, the light going gold and flat, the lake asserting itself in the wind, the city doing its last extravagant thing before it buckled down for what was coming. Elowen stood at the kitchen window of the northwest apartment and looked at the trees doing their October work and thought about a year. The distance a person could travel in a year if the year required it. She cooked lamb. She set 2 plates. She lit 2 candles. She called Cassian at 5:30 and said, "Simply come for dinner." He said he would. He affirmed at 7 with nothing in his hands, and she let him in, and he came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw the table. He looked at the lamb, the 2 candles, the plates set opposite each other. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them named it. The naming of it would have been less than the things itself. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She brought the food to the table and sat across from him, and they ate in the particular quiet that existed between 2 people who had too much history for silence to be empty. The lamb was good. She had been making it for 20 years, and she knew how it was supposed to taste, and it tasted the way it was supposed to. The candles burned low and steady in the draft-free kitchen. Outside the city made its evening sounds. From the next room, June slept with the committed totality of a 4-month-old who had recently discovered that sleep was the most efficient way to grow. Halfway through dinner, Elowen reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She set the wedding ring on the table between them. She had been carrying it there for 3 weeks. She had taken it out of the drawer where it had been, since she'd returned from the hospital, and put it in the pocket, without making a decision. Because she had learned over the past year that some decisions resolved themselves better when you gave them space, rather than forcing them toward a conclusion. She carried it in the pocket and waited, and tonight the decision had arrived, clearly and without drama. Cassian looked at the ring. He looked at her face. He did not touch it. "I'm not asking for our old marriage back," she said. "Neither am I. I'm not here because I need you. I know. I'm not here because of June. She's reason enough for us to be good parents together. She is not reason enough to pretend something is whole when it isn't. I understand that." She looked at him across the table in the candlelight. 7 years. A marriage that had broken in a specific and documentable way on a specific night and had then not repaired. Nothing that cracked, that completely simply repaired, been rebuilt. Painstakingly and without guarantee into something with a different architecture. She looked at the man who had walked out the door and then, imperfectly and without drama, learned to walk back in. She picked up the ring. She turned it in her fingers. The gold was warm from weeks of her body heat. She slipped it onto her finger. Not because things were fixed. She was clear-eyed enough to know they would never be fixed in the sense of being restored to a previous state. Previous state had been what it had been, something she had accommodated, and something she had lost herself inside, slowly and without quite noticing. Until one night, she had counted 11 weeks of waiting for a moment and found herself still Witsix, while a door clicked shut. She put the ring on because she was choosing this. Consciously, deliberately, with the full information of who he was and who she was and what the work ahead of them looked like. She was choosing it because she had built a life from nothing, and she had come back from a federal case filed under her name, and she had raised a daughter through the hardest months of her life, and she had done all of it as herself. Not as anyone's wife or victim or dependent, just as herself, fully, and she was choosing from that place, not from fear or need, or the particular exhaustion that made people stay in things because leaving seemed too large. She was choosing it because she wanted to. That distinction was everything. Cassian looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He reached across the table and took her hand, the one with the ring, warm under his palm, and held it. Not the practiced gesture she had watched him perform in public for 6 years, the performed ease of a man who knew how to project the right thing. This was different, slower, less certain. The way you held something you understood could still be lost. His thumb moved across her knuckles, once, slowly. She didn't pull away. In the next room, June made a small sound in her sleep, not waking, just the unconscious announcement of her presence, the ongoing declaration that a new person had arrived and would continue to arrive, more completely, every day. They heard it together. The candles burned. The dinner continued. Cassian's phone was in his jacket pocket. It did not buzz. Even if it had, he would not have looked at it. She knew this now, not because he had promised it, but because she had watched him not look at it for months in waiting rooms and hospital corridors and ordinary Thursday evenings until the not looking had become simply who he was in a way that no longer required effort. That was the only version of the change that mattered. Not the version that required effort. The version that had become true. They finished dinner. Elowen cleared the plates, and Cassian followed her to the kitchen and stood at the counter while she moved around the space that was hers. In the kitchen she had chosen, in the apartment she had built into a home while he had not been part of the building. He didn't try to help unless she handed him something. He just stood there, present, and that was the right thing to do, and he knew it. She handed him a dish towel. He dried the plates she washed without being asked what to do with them, because he had been here often enough now to know where the plates went. And this ordinary knowledge, the location of the plates in Elowen's kitchen, was the kind of knowledge that accumulated slowly and without ceremonies, and meant something regardless of whether it was acknowledged. June woke up at 9:15. Elowen went to her. She picked her up 4 months of solid, opinionated, increasingly certain small person, and June registered the familiar arms and familiar voice and settled almost immediately, still grumbling but less urgent about it. making the transitional sounds of someone deciding whether the situation required full protest or whether this would suffice. "This will suffice," Elowen told her. Cassian appeared in the nursery doorway. Elowen looked at him. He looked at June. She held June toward him, a small deliberate extension, not handing her over, just showing him, offering the proximity. He came in and stood close and put his hand very carefully against the back of June's head. Just his palm, warm and still, the way he had touched the crib railing weeks ago to understand that something was real. June looked at him with the absolute unflinching assessment of a 4-month-old, the kind of look that had no social overlay on it yet, just direct perception. She looked at him and made a small sound that was neither protest nor endorsement, just acknowledgement. He looked back. Something in his face and the set of it was the face of a person who had encountered the specific irreversible thing that makes every previous accounting of what matters feel inadequate. He was looking at his daughter in the low nursery light and being remade by the looking, and Elowen watched it happen and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. Not forgiveness exactly. Something more practical than forgiveness. Then understanding that the person standing in this room was not only the person who had walked out of the dinner, he was also this present, still, remade. Both were true. People were multiple truths at once, and she had always known this, and applying it here was not weakness. It was just accuracy. They did not move back in together that night, or in the weeks that followed. The Northwest apartment remained hers. She had made it hers, and it was hers, and she was not in a hurry to give that up, and Cassian did not suggest it. They built toward something different, not a restoration of the penthouse life, but a third thing, a new structure, and with the kind of care that came from knowing exactly what happened when care was not applied. He had a key, not to move in, but to come and go without knocking, because he was June's father and June's father needed access to his daughter without the performance of knocking at his own child's door. The key was practical. She had given it to him with that explanation, and he had taken it with the same understanding. He used it with a consciousness she could feel, never arriving unannounced, unless it was for June, never treating the access as permission to fill space beyond what was offered. He had learned to read what was available, which was something she had needed from him for 7 years, and had not known how to extract until she had stopped needing it, and then it had simply appeared. She continued the consulting work under her own name. She built the practice carefully, and on her own terms. Clients who knew her as Elowen Hart, who came to her through professional referrals, who paid her properly for the work she was doing and had always been doing. The legitimacy of it, the clean documentation of it, the proper compensation, these things mattered to her in a way that was hard to explain, and that she didn't particularly try to explain. She had spent 6 years doing this work invisibly. She was done with invisible. Cassian restructured. Slowly, methodically, with the precision he brought to all structural processes. The legitimate holdings became more fully legitimate, not overnight, because these things didn't work overnight, and anyone who claimed otherwise was selling something, but progressively, in ways that produced real results in the documentation and the relationships and the legal exposure. He hired people to do the work properly. He let go of the parts of the operation that could not be made clean. He told her about it when they talked, not asking for credit. Just talking, the way people talked when they were in the process of something, and needed to say it out loud to make it real. She listened. Sometimes she had thoughts. He listened to them. The year turned. June grew into herself with the particular speed and specificity of infants, becoming daily more insistently who she was allowed in her preferences, interested in everything, possessed of a gravitational quality that made rooms organize around her without her having to do anything but exist. She had Elowen's mouth and Cassian's eyes, and a temperament that appeared to belong entirely to herself, which seemed appropriate. On an evening in the following October a year, and some weeks from the dinner that had broken everything open, Elowen was sitting in the kitchen of the apartment that was now, as of 3 months ago, theirs together. Not the penthouse, not the Northwest rental, a third place, chosen deliberately, which smelled of the coffee she made in the mornings, and the cedar of the furniture she had moved from the northwest apartment, and the particular warm smell of a living space that contained a child who was growing fast, and leaving evidence of the growing everywhere she looked. June was asleep. Cassian was at the counter reading something on his phone. She was across the kitchen at the table with her laptop open and the consulting file for a new client spread across the screen. And the apartment was doing the quiet thing it did in the evenings when the day had been managed and the night was settling in. She looked at him. Just looked, for a moment, without him knowing she was looking. He was reading something. He had his coffee. His jacket was over the chair beside him, and his tie was gone, because he had arrived and taken it off immediately the way he did when he was done with the day. And there was something ordinary and unremarkable about the scene because of everything that had preceded it extraordinary. He looked up. He caught her looking. She didn't look away. He looked at her in the kitchen light with his face doing the real thing, the unmanaged, the thing she had spent 7 years catching only in glimpses. She looked back. From the next room, June made a small sound and settled back into sleep. "You're staring," he said. "I'm looking," she said. "There's a difference." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The thing before a smile. She turned back to her laptop. He turned back to his phone. The apartment continued its quiet evening around them, and outside the Chicago October did its slow gold work on the world. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, two people were building, carefully and without guarantee, the thing that came after. Not the thing before. Never the thing before. Something new. Something earned.